In our first episode of the Motive RB and GT-R tuning guide, we look at 10 facts that people often get wrong about the Skyline GT-R. I've heard so many times that the name Godzilla was given to the R32 because it dominated touring car racing in Japan and around the world. Well, that is total rubbish. The name Godzilla was given to the R32 before Group A racing even started, and in fact it wasn't even given to the car in Japan. It was given to the R32 Skyline GT-R right here in Australia. Now, back in July 1989, as the GT-R was launching, the editor of Wheels magazine, Phil Scott, was putting the car onto the cover and was trying to come up with a catchphrase to put along with Skyline Supercar. Now, the journalist that wrote the article on the GT-R said, "We should put on there Obakomono." And he said, "What? No, people reading that won't even be able to pronounce it properly," which I probably even didn't. And then he said, "Well, what does it actually mean?" And the journalist said, "It basically means monster in Japanese." And the editor turned to him and said, "What? Like Godzilla?" And the name stuck from there. Now, since then, a lot of magazines, including Wheels, have used the word Godzilla to describe the R33, the R34 and the R35. So realistically, it's not an official name from Nissan or Nismo or anyone else, so you can call any GT-R Godzilla if you like. There you go, the magazines have done it, you can do it too. But that is where the name started, right here in Australia in 1989. Now, if you watch our channel, you'll know that I think that Australians lead the way for GT-R development. What you don't know is that Australians were leading GT-R development right back from when the car originally was launched and they started getting it ready for Group A racing. To be more specific, the guys at Gibson Motorsport were pushing the RB26 and the GT-R chassis to its limit before they even debuted it in its very first race at the end of 1990. Now, one of the big problems that the guys from Gibson Motorsport had was the cracking of the standard RB26 block. It was cracking above the oil feed and cracking on the deck, exactly like the aftermarket industry learnt in the early to mid 2000s, and we've been talking a lot about lately in our Platinum Tech series. So we spoke to Alan Heafy, who used to be at Gibson Motorsport, and he told us that basically he took all of the information about the damage that was happening to those blocks, gave it to Nissan in Japan, and asked them to modify the block to be stronger. Now, they weren't told exactly what Nissan did to the block. In a matter of weeks, not months, weeks, they got back new blocks to use in the Group A car. And lo and behold, those blocks they put in didn't crack, and they still haven't cracked to this day. And essentially, that block is what became the Nismo N1 block. So that's right, Australians are partly responsible for developing the N1 block for the GT-R that was used in Group A racing and then various models of GT-Rs ever since. Now, if you watch our Platinum Tech series, you'll see that we cut open an N1 block and we actually did discover exactly what made it better, so make sure you check that out. Now, it's common knowledge that Nissan Australia bought 100 R32 Skyline GT-Rs into Australia to sell as part of their Group A touring car racing campaign. But what a lot of people don't know is they weren't actually the first to bring the R32 GT-R to Australia. That honour belongs to Scuderia Imports, who also built 6 special edition GT-Rs as well. We're in the process right now trying to track one of those cars down and do a full feature on it on our channel, so stay tuned for that one. This next fact bugs me quite a lot because so many people that are involved in the GT-R industry get it wrong, and that is how to spell GT-R correctly. Now, on the badge, it is simply G, T, and an R below it. But when you spell it as part of writing or in a title or in a description, etc., it is GT-R. But then again, we all know that it really is GT-R. Now, a lot of people seem to think that you can just pull a fuse on a GT-R and put it into rear-wheel drive mode. Now, this is true, but it also isn't. but it also is, but it isn't. Now, on the R32 GT-R, that does work. You can just pull the fuse or wire in a switch to that fuse, or you can actually do a key banger where you turn the car on and off while it's moving, and it will go into complete two-wheel drive. However, that doesn't work on the R33 and R34 GT-R in full, but to explain why, we need to take a quick look at how the four-wheel drive system works. So the mechanical side of how the all-wheel drive works in a GT-R is actually really simple. It's the electronics that are complicated. Basically, there is a pump which builds pressure, and there is a solenoid that helps control how much pressure goes down a line and pushes on a plunger on the back of the gearbox. The force on that plunger then determines how much force goes on the clutch packs in the transfer case, which determines the amount of torque to the front wheels. So when you're doing nothing or cruising along with light throttle, the solenoid isn't letting any pressure in, but the pump is also off, so you basically have 0 PSI in the system. So if you remove the fuse on an R32 GT-R or wire in a switch to it, you have complete rear-wheel drive because there is no pressure in the system. Now, things changed in the R33 and R34 GT-R. They went to a twin solenoid system, and one of those solenoids would actually hold residual pressure in the system, approximately 30 PSI. And the reason they did that is they discovered that how long it took to build 30 PSI was just as long as it took to go from 30 to say 250 PSI. So they decided to keep a base pressure of 30 PSI in the system, which would make the four-wheel drive system react a lot faster. So basically the R32 is a bit, well, slow to react with the all-wheel drive, which you'd notice when driving it. Well, the 33 and 34, they engage front torque a lot quicker than what they do in the 32. It's basically a more advanced and modern all-wheel drive system. So what that means is that residual pressure, if you pull the fuse, you still have 5 or 10% torque going to the front wheels, which is why you either have to remove the prop shaft when you dyno it in two-wheel drive mode, or you want to do a burnout, etc., or go to an aftermarket option where you put in a completely different controller, such as Motec or ETS Pro or something like that, so you can control it differently than the factory ATTESA ETS Pro computer does, so that you can go into two-wheel drive in an R33 and R34 and do burnouts. Another fun fact about all of this is that in the R32, when you do put into two-wheel drive with a switch or a key banger, and you want to go back to all-wheel drive, you actually have to turn the car off, stationary, start it again while stationary, and let the computer reset. And that gets really, really annoying when you're at the drag strip, you've done a warm-up burnout, and you actually have to turn the car on and off again so that you can then do your launch. Following on from talking about how the all-wheel drive system works mechanically, let's talk about how it works electronically. Now, a lot of people think that the all-wheel drive system works simply by detecting wheel spin in the back. It then puts power to the front, which is only partially true, but mostly incorrect. Because let's face it, by the time you've got wheel spin at the back, it's too late. You could have done with that power at the front much earlier. So the ATTESA ETS and ATTESA ETS Pro all-wheel drive system works with quite a lot of inputs actually. There is 2 lateral G sensors, 1 longitudinal G sensor, and it then takes a throttle and RPM input, and it has the ABS and braking input as well. And it takes all of those inputs to work out what the driving conditions are to determine how much power should go to the front. In a straight line, it determines if you're launching, accelerating, or if you're cruising at low or high speeds. Low speed cruising is all rear-wheel drive, while high speed cruising can add some front torque for stability. During cornering, it works out if you are steady state or accelerating in both low and high friction situations to determine the amount of front torque. Under braking, it knows how much front torque to apply to essentially give a center diff effect for better braking. As you can see, the all-wheel drive system in the GT-R is actually quite advanced, and one of the reasons why the car is so fast and able to use its power so well. We could literally talk about the all-wheel drive system for an hour in a technical video, so we probably will in a future episode. Now, we all know that the R32, R33 and R34 GT-R are all Skylines. Now, in the Skyline family, you have base model, non-turbo, taxi spec, 4 doors and 2 doors before you move up to the sportier GTs, and then you have the GTS, GTS 25T and GTT turbo models, and you have the GTS4 all-wheel drive models, and there are combinations of turbo and non-turbo before you step up to the GT-R. Now, there are plenty of differences between the GT-R and its little brothers, but there are plenty of similarities that make it part of the same family as well. Now, the Skyline did continue after R34 in Japan with the V35 and the V37 Skyline. They were called Infinities in America. However, the R35 GT-R was not based on the Skyline platform. It was a totally different bespoke platform, and that's why Nissan didn't call it a Skyline. It was simply called the Nissan GT-R. When it came out, the R35 actual code wasn't used, but so many people just used the word R35 because it made it easier to describe which GT-R you're talking about, and R35 does appear in some chassis codes for that car. So essentially now, Nissan also pretty much calls it the R35 GT-R as well. So call it that, but don't call it a Skyline, because it's not. If you've been around the GT-R scene, you would have heard the phrase RH9 and probably even seen RH8, RH7 and all that on cars' number plates and stuff as well. But what does it mean? RH9 stands for Record Holders 9-Second Club. Now, when it started in the late 90s, essentially RH9 was an achievement or a club where it was basically for any street car on a radial tyre that ran a 9.99 or better. There wasn't RH8 or RH7 or that stuff. It was just for 9.99 or better. But here's the thing. Back then, the only cars that were running 9s on a street tyre that were street cars were GTRs. So everyone thought that RH9 was just for GTRs, and it kind of naturally evolved that way anyway. Now, in the early 2000s, what happened is a whole bunch of different workshops that had RH9 GTRs, they got together and formed, I guess, a conglomeration, a partnership, whatever you want to call it, of Club RH9. And as part of that, they produced merchandise such as cups and shirts and jackets and stickers and things like that. But they also produced some of their parts under the RH9 banner. So you could buy an RH9 inlet manifold for a GTR at one point. And now, if you jump online and have a look around, you can find RH9 steering wheels and some exhausts and things like that. So essentially, RH9 is a group of workshops that got together and basically teamed up so that they could market some specific parts. Now, some of those workshops include some very famous tuning shops, including Top Secret, Garagesaurus, Narita Dogfight, Top Fuel, Phoenix's Power, and more. So it was a pretty cool group of workshops that got together for it. Does RH9 still exist? It does, but it's not all GTR stuff. But let's face it, RH9 is all about GTRs for people that are car enthusiasts. But just remember, there's technically no such thing as RH8, RH7, etc. That's just something guys have wanted to do to put on their number plates for some fun. So RH9, $9.99 or better for a street car on a radial tyre. So what is the rarest GTR? For this segment, we're not going to talk about the Nismo specials. We're going to talk about cars that left the Nissan factory and are a GTR model. Now, I know some people love to go, I've got one of 12 Series 3s in red or whatever. Forget all that. We're talking about a specific sub-model of GTR. Which one is the rarest of them all? So there's nearly 44,000 R32 GTRs produced, which is quadruple what they made of the R34 with 11,500. And there was 16,668 R33s. So the R33 is actually closer to production numbers to the R34 than it was the R32. So one of the most common GTRs that people think is super rare is the R34 GTR M-Spec NER and V-Spec 2 NER. Well, there was 285 M-Spec NERs made, which makes them pretty rare, but there was actually 718 V-Spec 2 NERs. So they're not as rare as some people think. In fact, the R32 Nismo is rarer at 560 models, and the four-door R33 from Autech has 416 models. The rarest Nissan Skyline GTR models are the N1s. There was only 245 R32s, 87 R33s, and 56 R34 GTR N1s. Now, we're not going to break it down into which one's a base model, a V-Spec 1 or a V-Spec 2, etc. We're just going to talk about N1s as a whole. And that's the other thing, when it comes to rarity with colours, some people try to make their colour sound rare by saying it was a Series 3 V-Spec in that colour. Stop it with that stuff. It's either a certain colour or it's a certain model, but don't use them all together to try and say that your car is some super rare GT-R. But there are a couple of paint colours that are, well, I guess reasonably rare. Which ones are they? In the R32, the rarest is light blue metallic, with only 141 made. The rest, in the thousands, who cares? In the R33, there was only 12 AR2 active reds and 22 in GV1 black pearl. And what many people don't realise is there was actually 2,500 midnight purple R33s made, as many as there is silver ones. So midnight purple actually isn't rare in an R33 GT-R. In the R34 GT-R, there's 68 in yellow as the rarest colour, 122 in active red, 131 in silica breath, and then there's 199 in midnight purple 3, 300 in millennium jade, and funnily enough, 347 were made in midnight purple 2. So it is relatively rare, but it's not the rarest colour in the R34 GT-R by a long shot. Now here's a fun fact about rarity with the R34 GT-R. The V-Spec 1 had over 4,100 made, which is 70% more than there was the base model. And if you add up the V-Spec 1 and V-Spec 2 production run, there is twice as many of them as there is base model R34 GT-Rs. So technically, an R34 is twice as rare in a base model as it is in a V-Spec model. Now when it comes to colours, white and Bayside Blue were the most common colour for an R34 GT-R. Our last fact about this Skyline GT-R is, well, it's a fun fact, and that is that the very famous Bayside Blue colour in the R34 GT-R was actually going to be called Wangan Blue, named after the famous Wangan freeways around Tokyo. However, in the late 90s, when the Midnight Club had a massive crash on the Wangan freeway, the guys at Nissan decided, maybe we should disassociate ourselves from that name, so the colour was called Bayside Blue.